sharing a lot of links in the chat box. So keep an eye on that. We do have a sign-in document in the chat box. And I just have a few housekeeping reminders before we get started today. Obviously, we are using Zoom. We'd love you to use the chat box for Q&A throughout the course of the day. Some of our presenters are saving Q&A till the end of their presentation, so we will get to your questions when we're able to, but feel free to use that chat box at any time, also for tech questions as well. We're going to have audio and video turned off during the presentations. We'll have them turned back on when we get into some breakout sessions later today and tomorrow. But for now, we're going to have the audio turned off during the presentations. Again, that chat box will have relevant links throughout the day, and we have a large document that you'll have access to those links as well. So if it's too much. I'm Becca Plum. I'm sorry, I should have said that first. I'm from the American Visionary Art Museum. If you're interested in getting your certificate for professional development hours, please contact me directly. My email is all over the Eventbrite, becca@avam.org, and we can get you set up with that. Finally, I just wanted to say thank you so much to our collaborators. This is such a special workshop that we've put together today. So thank you to Bernice Steinhardt and Claire Tesh of Art and Remembrance. Thank you to Jennifer Goss and her staff at Echoes and Reflections, and AVAM staff, especially Mavette Rosas, who is our tech superstar here. So first I want to introduce AVAM's founder and director and principal curator, Rebecca Hoffberger, for some opening remarks. So Rebecca,
well, thank you so much, dear Becca. I wanted to welcome everyone. And yes, I'm the founder and director of the museum, but I'm also the curator, blessed to be, of Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. First off, that was inspired by the amazing spirit of the first person testimony of one of the most palpably loving human beings I've ever encountered, just through her work and her words. And that is Esther Nisenthal. And without the two daughters, Bernice and Helene, with their ability to share not only their mother's story, but really their family story with everyone else, this exhibition and our collaboration would not have been possible. What is such a powerful moment is right now. And so all of you who are looking on television where the ancient evil that was experienced by Esther and her family, but was experienced in Rwanda with people of the same skin tone against each other, what we did with Native Americans, all of that is looked at to get to the roots of how human beings can conceive of another human being as less important, as their lives having less meaning, and then behavior that reinforces that errant perception. So in Esther and the Dream of One Loving Family, we look at it on an individual. Perhaps many of you know the name of Matthew Shepard, who was literally crucified by people he didn't know just because he was a young gay man. We look at Raphael Lemke's work, who was the person who came up with the term genocide. And then we look throughout our human history at times where a person is deemed less. So what has come into our living room, and I know it was broadcast world over, was the casual, with hands in pocket, murder on screen of George Floyd. But that is also echoed with a sleeping Breonna Taylor. So we're at an amazing time to make very real to your students what the price is when you demonize another, even within their peer level. I think, whether it's bullying or otherwise. So one of the things to make such a heavy subject feel more personable to little kids, etc., and we have a broad audience, is that, as Bernice was saying before, we took the images of her mother's happy home, thatch roof, dirt floor, chickens, brother, sisters, parents she loved, family traditions, religion, favorite foods, and we juxtapose that with the story in Rwanda, same thatch roof, log home, chickens, cow, what happiness interruptus becomes. And you can see that that still gets played out to this day. So in this time, I'd like to quote two people that whose quotes and thoughts and heart are in this show on a wall of universal quotes. And the first comes from John Lewis, who we just lost, who was called the conscience of our Congress. And he said, when you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to say something. You have to do something. And again, all our educators, you're in the position to really help nurture the higher angels in all of your students. And then Theodore Roosevelt, who long before this said, this country, meaning America, will not be a good place for any of us to live in unless we make it a good place for all of us to live. So today, I'm so excited to learn from all of you and with all of you, but my heart really goes to Bernice, who has given us the privilege of really premiering her mom's work and then working to send that out all over the world, and then choosing and having the trust in us to bring it back and to even magnify the issue at hand, and that is the demonization of another by one person. I must say that in December, we had the privilege of bringing all 28 ambassadors from the EU, including the head ambassador, Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, to tour the museum. And I can tell you, they were not in the mood to tour. They were jet lagged. They had been schlepped to all these places in the morning, and all they wanted was the cocktail that was going to await them. But they came through because Stavros insisted that they come and see Esther and the dream of one loving human family and our exhibition, The Secret Life of Earth. And I have never seen so many people weep. They were hit by something that spoke to them so deeply. And then it was Stavros who opened his own address that night with a quote he saw on the wall. And it came from Pablo Casals. He said, love of one's own country is a splendid thing, but why should love stop at the border? And with that, it's such a privilege to introduce and to thank Echoes and Reflections, which is really respected as a premier source for educators on Holocaust education. So this is a marvelous uniting with the incredible work that Bernice and Claire have done with Art and Remembrance. And we're so privileged to have all of you as partners. So today, you're all in for such a special treat.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that intro. And as she mentioned, I'm now going to introduce Jen Goss from Echoes and Reflections. She is a senior trainer at Echoes and Reflections, in addition to being a full-time high school social studies teacher in Stanton, Virginia. She holds dual MAs in Holocaust and Genocide Studies and American History, and is a United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Teacher Fellow. So Jen, do you want to get started?
Yes, good morning and welcome everybody. And Rebecca, thank you for that lovely overview to our time together. I know it's something that I'm greatly looking forward to as well. And while I'm sad we aren't able to be in the museum today, I'm delighted that technology allows us to still have this opportunity to work together. Echoes and Reflections has been around since 2005, and our primary goal is to support secondary educators in teaching their students about the difficult topic of the Holocaust. We have specifically designed content and resources that are both student and teacher facing that work to engage students in the topic, thinking critically about it, as well as making appropriate, relevant connections to what is happening in the world today. And to date, we've worked with over 70,000 educators across the country. And so we're really excited to welcome all of you to that fold, as well as to ignite these partnerships with both AVAM and Art and Remembrance. We're going to begin this morning by just talking a little bit about what our goals will be over the course of the next 2 days. We're going to be starting out with an exploration of our pedagogical approaches for both planning and implementing Holocaust education in the classroom. We'll be looking at some specific instructional enhancements that'll support both student learning to focus on the life and art of Esther Nisenthal, as well as helping each of you discover additional classroom-ready assets, including things like lesson plans, visual history testimonies, and other primary and secondary sources. Along the way, we hope to enhance your personal knowledge about the Holocaust, including the history of anti-Semitism, and build your confidence and capacity to teach this complex topic. The very first thing that I would like to do is to introduce you to the pedagogical principles that Echoes and Reflections believes is the core of effective and also considerate Holocaust education. This is a tough topic to teach about. I've been in the classroom now going on 19 years and have been teaching this topic for the bulk of it. And it's something that's very difficult for us to engage with students about because they're interested in it, but it also brings forth some very tough topics and things that are challenging to discuss with students in this age and maturity level. So we encourage educators as they embark upon their study of this topic with students to ensure that they define terms, and I'll be showing you a resource this morning that'll help us accomplish that goal. We believe whether you're teaching about the Holocaust for 45 minutes or for the entirety of your school year, that it's important that your students at least have a fundamental understanding of what anti-Semitism is. We believe along the way you should be providing appropriate historical context, which you can certainly do using primary sources, as we're going to be exploring over the course of our time together. And also to teach the human story, which we will certainly be doing through the story of Esther and other individuals that you're going to meet. We also hope that you are able to encourage critical thinking among your students. And some of that critical thinking may be how you can make the Holocaust relevant to students in your classroom. We always encourage, though, to think about appropriate relevancy. You don't want your students making simple connections and engaging in comparisons of pain. However, there are ways that we'll be discussing that you can make connections to some of those very important events that Rebecca mentioned at the beginning of our program today. We also think that it's important to foster empathy with your students, to engage them in thinking about other human beings, their experiences during this challenging time, as well as the challenges that others in their world are facing today. And lastly, to ensure a supportive learning environment. One of my mentors said to me very early on in my career, when teaching about the Holocaust and other difficult histories, it's really important for us to lead students safely into a topic area and then lead them safely out. That as educators, that is one of our obligations. And it's something that I've personally tried to abide by in the years that I've been teaching this topic. And we'll share some of those strategies with you as well. What I'd like to invite you to do now is to think about these 9 pedagogical principles. Think about where your strengths are. If you've been a veteran educator of this topic, it might be an easier and quicker process to consider those strengths, but where are your strengths? And then where are your points of growth? And I'd like to then send you to a site, menti.com. You can access this site via the device that you're using by exiting the full screen of Zoom, opening a new tab, and going to menti.com. Or you can utilize your cell phone or tablet or another device that you have nearby. When you get to Menti, you're going to have the option to first pick which pedagogical principle you think is your biggest strength. And then you're going to advance to the next screen and you're going to be asked to pick which pedagogical principle you want to work on over the course of the next few days, or 2 days together. You'll then be able to advance to a third slide. Please, for now, just ignore that third slide. That's going to be a concluding exercise later on. So please just for now focus on what is your strength in the pedagogical principles, and then which is a pedagogical principle that you would like to work on. And so let's go ahead and take about 2 minutes to just do that reflection.
Hi there. In the chat box, I just got a question saying that they just tried to access the website and asking for a code. The code is right next to the website itself. So the code that it's requesting is 905948.
I just remember to flip forward to that slide as well, so you also now have it on your screen. But thank you, Becca. Okay, so I know that some of you are still reflecting, but I'm going to go ahead and take us into the Menti a while and tell you a little bit more about Mentimeter, if it's a platform that you're unfamiliar with. I know that many of us are going to be going back into the classroom very soon. In fact, I return on Monday, and certainly the start of our school year this year is going to be far different than many of us have ever experienced in our years in education. When we were asked in March to pivot to fully virtual instruction, one of the things that I was most concerned about was student engagement. How can I engage my students despite the fact that we were separated through screens? And so Menti was a platform that I had previously used in my classroom for entrance and exit tickets. And I found that it was actually a very powerful tool as well to use for fully virtual instruction. And so it's completely free. You access it by mentimeter.com. And as the educator, that's the platform where you set it up. And then you simply give your students menti.com as the entry point, which I just did with all of you this morning. And then you're given a code, which you see at the top of the screen when you set up your Menti. And so there are a lot of different options, and we're going to be exploring some of the different ways that you can use Menti in our program today and tomorrow. You can set up things like word clouds and rankings and so on and so forth. I also saw somebody made the comment in the chat box, it'd be great to be able to select multiple choices, which might be one of the options. I'm not sure if it is with the free version, but I think it is with the paid version, which you can, of course, with most educational resources, pay to upgrade. And so, of course, this one is just a simple multiple choice. And I can see by examining our responses that many of us do feel like we're already pretty effective at teaching the human story. And so I'm excited that we have a good, strong foundation in that, because I think that's going to make it easier for us to incorporate Esther's story and the story of some of the other individuals that we're going to meet into our existing classroom instruction. It's also great to see that many of you feel confident about ensuring a supportive learning environment and fostering empathy. And then I see others have identified strengths as encouraging critical thinking, making the Holocaust relevant, using primary sources and providing historical context, as well as defining terms and examining anti-Semitism. If you've not yet had the opportunity to reflect and respond, this option will remain open to you. But I'm now going to move forward into what we're going to work on over the course of the next couple days. And I see that both relevancy and encouraging critical thinking, which do largely go hand in hand, are seen as two areas that we want to explore more heavily. And we will certainly be doing that with our planned programming. and then also providing historical context, which is something that I feel personally Echoes and Reflections does a really great job with, and that's why I'm excited for this pairing with AVAM and Arts and Remembrance for us to bring that aspect to the table. Defining terms, we'll be talking about that in just a short while, as well as examining anti-Semitism, fostering empathy, teaching the human story, and using primary sources. So again, we'll be keeping these principles in mind in the working document that each of you was provided with in the chat box. And if you missed it, we can provide it again. You will see that we have right under the sign-in sheet a copy of the link to our pedagogical principles. And so you can click on that link. It'll take you to a full listing and exploration, as well as a video toolbox that looks at those pedagogical principles, as well as additional articles and essays that explore some of those pedagogical principles even further. So we look forward to engaging with them, with you over the course of our time together. And now I'd like to bring in Claire Tesh, who is the founder and principal of LMNO Education. For over 20 years, from both the classroom and the boardroom, Claire is focused on social justice learning, immigrant rights, and introducing deliberative dialogue into classrooms and communities. Welcome, Claire.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you to all the educators and community leaders who are taking time out of their very busy schedules, getting back into the classroom. And I'm hoping that you can bring a lot of these tools in. I like what Jennifer said about, leading students safely. And I think that using the artwork of Esther Krinitz is different than what's in the textbooks and films that might be black and white and not really connecting to young people. So we look forward today to going through some of these tools that you can bring with you. And we're going to start with looking at pre-war life and shadows of hate.
All right, and so with that, we're going to take you now to the Echoes and Reflections website. It's very easy to access at echoesandreflections.org, and I'm going to drop that link for you in the chat box. But again, all of the links and items that we're going to be sharing with you today are available to you in the working document. And we'll be adding to that throughout our program today. It's our hope that you'll be able to not only utilize this working document as a reference sheet to refer back to, but also as an example of another way that you can engage your students in either synchronous or asynchronous virtual instruction. Right now, I'm on the landing page of Echoes and Reflections, and I'm going to take you into what I call kind of the heart and soul of Echoes and Reflections, which is our Teach section. And so the Teach section provides you with all of the content that you need for student-facing classroom instruction. I mentioned one of our important goals and pedagogical principles is to define terms for students. And we have a really great tool to assist you with that I want to share with you before we get into our lesson plans themselves. This is our audio glossary, which is part of the revamp of Echoes and Reflections that occurred in 2017 when we launched our new and fully online components. And so what's really great about this audio glossary is that you can take and clip the URL from the top of the screen, you can copy it, and then you can add it to whatever learning management system you're using in your classroom, be it Canvas or Moodle or Google Classroom. And then it's available to your students during the duration of your study of the Holocaust. So if they're doing an exploration of Esther's life and art and they come across a word that they don't understand, it's quite likely that they'll be able to find its definition in this audio glossary. What's also really fantastic about this audio glossary is that it sounds out words that might be unfamiliar to those who speak English as their native language. I have many students that stumble over the pronunciation of Auschwitz.
Auschwitz.
Now they have the ability to have that sounded out for them. So you no longer have to fake how to say words like Belgic, Majdanek. You can utilize this as a practice tool as well. We also have a timeline of the Holocaust, which we'll be spending some time with tomorrow. I mentioned a few moments ago that we have a deeper exploration of our pedagogy. We also have a classroom poster series that you can download, as well as supporting content for Schindler's List. And then we have kind of the core of these resources, which is our lesson plans. Our lesson plans are organized across 11 different units. You can start with Unit 1 and work all the way through to present day with Unit 11 on contemporary anti-Semitism. But for today, we're going to be spending some time in the first 3 units. These resources are completely free and open access for educators. They're also open access for any institutions throughout the world that might be working with Holocaust education. And you can also make these links available to your students. So if you're in a school that has National History Day, you have the ability to utilize these resources. I'm going to actually begin in Unit 1, which is studying the Holocaust. This particular unit and all of the units in Echoes and Reflections are structured in the same fashion. Each unit begins with an opening quote. Aligned keywords are located to the right. Then for those of you that are teaching in Common Core states, we do have Common Core alignments. We also have further background on the specific topic here in the Preparing to Teach this unit, which is great for veteran educators who just want a quick review before they teach the topic again for the first time in a year, or for those of you who are new to the topic of teaching about the Holocaust. We'll talk more about our testimony and asset resource guides in just a short while. But we also provide you with great objectives for writing lesson plans, and then we go into our lesson plans themselves. The great thing about Echoes is that you can go through Echoes, and as I mentioned, start with Unit 1 and teach chronologically all the way through to Unit 11. Or if you're a more veteran educator or someone with limited time, you can go through and pick and pull resources that best fit your individual situation. And so our lesson plans are step-by-step instructions. Supporting content as well as additional notes and terminology are located on the right-hand side. We also have estimated completion times. And then at the bottom of every unit, we have additional reflect and respond questions, which are great for class discussions or journaling. And then we have extension activities in our Making Connections section. And so you can see we have a list usually of anywhere from 5 to 7 items for each unit. Each unit has 2 to 3 lesson plans. And in this particular unit, I just wanted to call your attention to the student handout on Holocaust definitions. For many of us, if we're going to be teaching with Esther's art, we may not have an extended period of time to teach about the topic of the Holocaust, but Esther's story is so compelling that we want to bring it in and then also provide students with some foundational knowledge about the Holocaust itself. This particular handout would be a great way to provide that foundational knowledge to our students. In a moment, when it loads on my screen, for some reason it's being slow, you'll see that the handout that comes up shares with you definitions from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and the Imperial War Museum in London. The purpose of this particular definition sheet and the exercise explained in the lesson plans is to have students examining how different institutions define the Holocaust. There are a lot of similarities between the definitions, but there are also a lot of differences as well. And so for students at the high school level, it's really great for them to talk about considerations that are made by historical institutions when they're defining a historical era. For students at the middle school level, this can be a great way to introduce them to new vocabulary and terminology by giving them the sheet, having them assigned to small groups with a specific definition, and then having them highlight words that they don't know, and using the Echoes and Reflections dictionary or even a traditional dictionary to define some of the words that they encounter. And then you can jigsaw them to discuss how the definitions are different amongst the group. I actually do this as an opening day exercise with my students, and something I'm going to be doing virtually this year because our first week of instruction is virtual, so I'm looking forward to that. And it'll enable me to use some breakout rooms and have my students getting to work together in small groups. So leaving this definition sheet and going back to the Echoes and Reflections main page, I'm now going to venture us into Unit 2, which focuses on anti-Semitism. As I mentioned as well, one of our pedagogical principles is helping your students to understand what anti-Semitism is. And so I want to now highlight for you a resource that will help students understand just very briefly not only about what anti-Semitism is, but give a little bit more insight into Esther's own experience. This first resource that I'm showing you, and which I will also drop into our master document, is a map of pre-war Jewish life, and this is pre-World War II. When you click on it, you saw it was very small, and I've now made it into a printable version. Again, you can clip this URL and put this printable version into your learning management system. You also have the ability with the map to zoom in on it. And I'm going to go ahead as well and put the link to this map in the chat box so that if any of you want to follow along and take a look at it as well, that you can. This map estimates the Jewish population in Europe and North Africa in about 1933, January of 1933, when Hitler came to power. I'd like to give you a moment now to explore this map, and in the chat box, just make a couple observations. What comes to mind when you see this map, which bar graph features the number of Jews in a country, the actual Jewish population, and then the pie chart shows the overall percentage of that country that was Jewish. And so again, just some general observations for us in the chat box. What do you see when you look at this map? And you can even think like a student. If your students were exposed to this map and you said, we're going to be studying the Holocaust, but first we want to look at Jewish life in Europe prior to the Nazi rise to power. Right, so I see one individual's mentioned, Rachel's mentioned, that there were large Jewish populations in the Soviet Union and Poland. Those of you that are world history teachers may know a little bit more about the Jewish diaspora and how the Jews that did end up into what would then become the Soviet Union when it was still Russia were pushed into the Western Soviet Union and Poland by Catherine the Great, who wanted to push them beyond the Pale of Settlement. And so that's part of the rationale behind this significant population cluster there. What else do we see? There's some other things that stand out.
Jenna, I'm not sure if you're seeing other comments. I think some are privately messaging me. So when you message, make sure you message to everybody, folks. But there's a...
Oh, yeah, I'm not seeing, I'm only seeing one. So if you want to read some of them out loud as well, that would be great.
Of course, yeah. I have power imbalance of marginalized peoples. Jews comprised a small percentage of the total population in most countries, but were perceived as such a threat. How small the total percent are. A large population of Jewish people were in Poland and the Soviet Union, exclamation point. I didn't know that the largest Jewish population was in Poland. Jews are spread all over the country. Let's see. Surprising low percentage in Germany.
Yeah, and I see Rebecca mentioned, I can see Jewish communities spread widely across Europe, from Norway as far as the Middle East. There are also large numbers of Jewish people in Poland, which had the largest population in the Soviet Union, which had a large population as well. And also, Mavette, it sounds like the everyone option isn't available in the chat box. I'm not sure if there's something that we can toggle to make that available.
I think I just made it available. That was my fault. Yeah, I found it.
That's okay. And that's, as educators, we can all appreciate the fact that tech can sometimes be challenging. So thank you. Yeah, and so I think another really interesting point that many students latch onto is the fact that the population in Poland is so large, but it's still only about 10% of the overall population. And so that's going to have a specific impact on Esther's experience. We're also going to be looking at, in just a short while, the experience of individuals who were Jewish growing up in Germany. And their experience is also going to be quite different because they're less than 1% of the population. And so in Germany, you know, the Jews are mainly living in urban areas. They're also, many of them are very highly assimilated. And so that's also going to factor into an exploration of the Holocaust. Claudetta mentions how amazing it is to start imagining on how differently all the Jews in different nations were being integrated and how those cultures were influencing them. And so I think that's something that's important for us to consider as we advance through our learning over the course of the next 2 days, is the Holocaust and the story of the people who experienced the Holocaust is individual in many ways. And so the experiences of Anne Frank are going to be very different than the experiences of Esther and the experiences of someone like Elie Wiesel, who many of you teach night. And so when we work with our students, it's wonderful to focus on a single story. There's a lot of power in that, but we also want to make sure that we utilize other supporting resources to share with our students the fact that there are other ways that people did experience the Holocaust. So I teach about the Holocaust in both my Holocaust and Genocide Studies elective, as well as in the US and Virginia history class that I teach. And in the US and Virginia history class, understandably, I have far less time to teach about the topic. But in both classes, I want students to have an understanding not only of pre-war Jewish life and what these individuals experienced as human beings who had hopes and dreams and made contributions to the communities where they lived, as Karen mentioned, but also for them to see this vast array of experiences that are going to be irrevocably altered by the Holocaust. And many students will then ask why. And so I share with them in my US and Virginia history, the pre-war map. We talk about some of the contributions and the ways that Jews lived. We use photographs from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. This coming year, I plan on incorporating some of Esther's art into my coursework, which I'm really excited about. And then I share with them this definition of anti-Semitism. And so again, this is one of our secondary source assets, like the map that I just shared with you. You can again clip the URL, share it in your learning management system with your students, and allow them to interact with it. And it says anti-Semitism is the term for hatred of Jews as a group or a concept. Hatred of Jews has existed since ancient times. In the 19th century, it was being influenced by modern scientific ways of thinking. The word anti-Semitism was coined in Germany by political activist Wilhelm Marr to represent this newer way of thinking. Semitism supposedly expressed all things Jewish, since at the time, national groups were frequently defined by their language, and the traditional language of Jews is Hebrew, which is a Semitic language. Of course, there is no such thing as Semitism, and all speakers of Semitic languages never belong to the same national or ethnic groups. Anti-Semitism may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim the inferiority of the Jews, their supposedly evil nature, or other negative ideas about Jews. It may include political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudiced or other stereotyped views about Jews derived from racial or other ideologies. So this first sentence, I think, is really critical for our understanding and the understanding of our students. Anti-Semitism is the term for hatred of Jews as a group or a concept. What do you think is the difference? And so now that we have the everyone feature engaged in the chat box, go ahead and select that feature and just share for us. What do you think is the difference between hating Jews as a group versus hating them as a concept? While you're taking a moment to respond, I just wanted to mention a somewhat new book. It's been out now, gosh, it seems maybe for about 6 months, but I think all of us have a skewed sense of time at the moment. And that it's called Anti-Semitism Here and Now by Deborah Lipstadt. And it goes into not only a history of anti-Semitism from the past, but as well unfortunate and contemporary applications of anti-Semitism in our society. And she really tackles this this idea of anti-Semitism with hating Jews as a group versus a concept. Missy mentions the hatred of people rather than the hatred of ideas, and Sarah's mentioning that a concept seems less personal and more abstract. I think that's something that is important for students to understand and can go hand in hand with that map that we just explored. If less than 1% of the population in your nation is Jewish, and we know that those individuals are largely concentrated into more urban areas where they're highly assimilated, the chances of someone actually knowing a Jewish individual versus hating them based on things that people could have heard is very important to understand. And I see that one of the other responses mentions, it's hating a group as a concept is based on cognitive distortions or embracing of rhetoric, propaganda, and manipulation by media coverage. And it's easier to hate an idea, Julia mentions, versus people that you actually know. And so it's definitely something I think we wanted to convey to our students and help them understand. And in our Unit 2 resources, we have additional background information for you. For the sake of the window of time that we have today, we're not going to be able to delve too heavily into these other additional resources, but we do have a great summary of anti-Semitism that is available here. It's a 2-page secondary source piece, which looks more at the history of anti-Semitism, how it came about, and also how it has evolved over time. It takes a look as well at the religious and economic and social implications of anti-Semitism. And then we have additional pieces in our 3rd lesson plan of this unit that actually look at Nazi propaganda. And so how were individuals in a nation conditioned to hate such a small group of people? And I saw someone, made the analogy to, we have a lot of hatred towards certain groups in our country right now, particularly immigrants from nations that we may not be very familiar with. And so propaganda certainly plays a huge role in that as well. One of the things in my own personal approach to teaching that I have found beneficial is if I engage my students in a conversation about present day propaganda, it's a very heated conversation because I have students from every realm of the political spectrum. They have their perspectives that they bring in, many of them with the influence of their parents. And we don't always accomplish our educational goals because everybody really has a visceral reaction to present day propaganda. But if I start with a conversation about propaganda from the past and I expose them to some of these examples from Nazi Germany and a bit of the foundational approaches of the different types of anti-Semitism, we can have a much more tempered and meaningful conversation about what propaganda is and how it works. And then we can springboard into the present and have a conversation that is a lot more measured and rational. And it's a really powerful tool, in my opinion, to approach that history. So how do we get to this point? How do we get from, individuals who lived amongst communities in many cases, particularly in Central and Western Europe, to them being vilified and then eventually annihilated as part of the Nazi final solution? Well, we explore that topic in Unit 3, which takes a look at Nazi Germany. Again, this unit is structured just like the other units in echoes and reflections, and it examines the overall arc of the Nazi rise to power. It gives students secondary and primary source pieces that help them understand what the situation was like in Nazi Germany during this time period, as well as the development of the preceding government, the Weimar Republic, and also how eventually rights begin to be stripped away from those who were identified as Jews. And so what I'd like to share with you now is this handout on the Weimar Republic and the rise of the Nazi Party. I'd like to have you open this link if you are able by clicking on it in the chat box. And I'd like you to take a few moments and just scan through this document. And as you're scanning through it, either on a piece of paper or feel free to jot in the chat box, what are some things that you think would stand out to your students as they explore this interwar period between World War I and Hitler's rise to power in January of 1933 and the initial establishment of the Nazi government and how they began to seize power? And so go ahead and take a moment to read through that document. I also see, Rebecca, a question in the chat box. So the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment it's actually one that's become more controversial as we've gotten into more contemporary times. There actually were some follow-up studies that were done by Jane Elliott where she talked about like how she would have probably not utilized her own students for the simulation purposes. Echoes our institutional perspective is to not use simulations with topics that are as fragile as teaching about the Holocaust. But I think for our students to understand the experiment and learn about it today from the perspective of how it was conducted is very valuable. So it's something that I talk about with my students actually from a psychological perspective. And so it's really interesting. So thank you for sharing that. Right, and so as you're reading, I'm just going to let you guys go ahead and read through this and type up some observations, and then in a few moments we'll reflect. Let's take about 4 minutes to read through this document. So I'm seeing a lot of great ideas in the chat box, and I'm seeing points about the overwhelming fact that Germany was so beaten down financially, and that's something our kids could relate to, this feeling of helplessness as we navigate being quarantined, and the work that's ahead regarding honoring diversity in our country. Liz mentioned needing a scapegoat for their many problems. Pamela's mentioning economic issues of the Weimar Republic were so disruptive, and the need to blame the Jews was so prevalent. As the United States enters a period of economic recession, how will these circumstances mirror what happened in Germany? It may not be attributed to the Jews, but anti-immigration fervor is similar. Marcia mentions our students today can make some types of correlations to what is happening in society today, how they feel, what they hear on the news, and comparisons, whether correct or incorrect, past, and trying to start this critical thinking gets the conversation going. I was part of a program a week or two ago with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and one of the talking points that they brought up I thought was really great. They said when you have a student or even an individual you're in conversation with making a comparison to the past, or particularly the Holocaust, start by saying, even if it's a comparison that you don't think is necessarily correct, say, I appreciate what you're saying, but now how can we talk about how these two situations might be different and how our approaches to them can be similar and different? And I thought that was a great question to use with students. Joanna mentions the justification of state-run media was to put an end to political lies. Missy's mentioning the horror and desperation and how it can so easily distort the ideas of others. Susan mentions when people are desperate, they need someone to blame. And students are seeing this now with the pandemic and social unrest. Sadly, we've seen a significant uptick in anti-Semitism in the time of the pandemic and blaming Jews for the pandemic. Also, a lack of leadership can create a void in a country, and that was certainly a problem in the Weimar Republic with the instability that existed there. And so many great comments in the chat box, and there's also a lot of things that our students can relate to, and also with things that are happening in our nation today, and what is being discussed both inside and outside of our government and the various political parties. But I think one of the things that's very crucial for our students to understand is that when there are times of desperation, it's quite easy to get people thinking about who they want to blame, even if it's a very, incorrect attribution for a specific thing. It's part of human nature, and it's something that people buy into. And so, as I had mentioned, when this conversation with a group of us through the museum, we were talking about when you have somebody that makes a comparison to the past, you respond by saying, I appreciate what you're saying, but in what ways were these two incidences different? And get people thinking critically about the differences and then the responses and then how we can build off of that in our responses today. But one of the things that I really find interesting for students to do when they ask the question, why would people have supported the Nazi Party, is have them look at this Nazi Party platform and replacing the word Germany with America or the words Germans with Americans. And they see then why people bought into the Nazi Party's beliefs. The Nazi Party did have anti-Semitism as one of its core tenets, but it wasn't the only thing that it was about. And so therefore, it was very easy for people to overlook some of the things that they might not have agreed with, because not every single German was anti-Semitic, but they were very desperate and they were willing to buy into political ideology that might have placed other people's needs below their own, or even eventually, as we know, led to a policy of extermination, as we will discuss a little bit more deeply tomorrow. So again, this handout is called The Weimar Republic and the Rise of the Nazi Party. There is also a handout in Unit 3, which takes a look at the advancement of anti-Semitic legislation in Nazi Germany. It's entitled Nazi Germany and Anti-Jewish Policy. And in just a moment, I'm going to turn things over to Claire, but I wanted to share this handout with you as well. And it's also mentioned in our large document because it talks about the gradual implementation of anti-Jewish policy in Germany, what would eventually be annexed Austria, and then the occupied Sudetenland between the years 1933 and 1938. And the key thing that I say here is that it's gradual. It's also important for us to think about the fact that while there was anti-Semitic policies of the Polish government in Poland that are going to affect Esther and her family, these are not the policies that are being implemented in Poland at this time. And so when people ask questions like, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they escape? For Esther and her family, these were policies of another nation. Nazi Germany had not yet invaded Poland. And also options are very limited during this time based on immigration laws, even in countries like the United States, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. So these documents are just an overview to give your students a bit of background. I'm now going to turn things over to Claire, who's going to share with us some resources from Art and Remembrance. And then in a few moments, we're going to take a look at some specific personal stories.
So the Art and Remembrance website, it's artandremembrance.org. We have many lesson plans, and I just wanted to kind of give you a peek of some that may connect to what we're learning today. One is an interactive, this is on a Satori platform. How many of you are familiar with Satori? You can just put it in the chat box. If not, it's a really great way to, you can modify this and share it within your classroom. We also have the traditional PDF lesson plans that you can easily modify. But here we have added in some films, some activities. There's forum questions that can be projected onto a whiteboard, or if you're teaching virtually, you can add these easily into your Google Classroom or whatever learning management system that you're using.
Sorry to interrupt. It looks like you're not sharing your screen. Can you?
Yeah. Oh, it says
just double check
sharing.
that? I'm gonna stop sharing and then can you share again? Sorry.
Yeah. Let's see. Is it sharing now?
I believe so. Yes. There you go.
Okay. Huh. It said share, you're sharing screen, so I don't know what was going on there. So I'm so sorry about that. So here is what a Satori looks like. And this is called World War II in Poland. And this is also what we're going to be doing tomorrow in terms of timelines. But I just wanted to show the educators and others here that there is some film clips. You can also add in whatever resources you want. These can easily be modified. Up here, you can share directly to a Classroom, Google Classroom, or other learning management system. We've included a lot of Esther's art, and here's where the website is. If you go to Art and Remembrance Education, this is the menu of lesson plans, and I'm going to go through more of these tomorrow. And here is today, one of the activities we're going to do later is a similarities and differences, which is basically what Jennifer just talked about. This would be an easy activity to do with, you know, starting 4th, 5th grade. The lesson that we used for this was called Children Escaping War and Conflict. And we used both the book Memories of Survival, which is the art of Esther Krinitz, as well as Brothers in Hope, which is fiction, but we found that sometimes using this to teach about primary sources, secondary sources, you know, what is a compilation of fact, what is made up, and so getting young students to understand true primary sources, also art as a source, as well as testimony and story. So we're going to do an activity on testimony that Jennifer is going to run, and feel free to use this T-square here, or Jennifer's also going to share a resource. And tomorrow we're going to take a deeper dive into the resources of Art and Remembrance. And I hand it off to you, Jen.
All right, thank you. I had to find my unmute button. So thank you, Claire, for sharing those. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm so excited personally to check some of these things out for use in my own classroom. So we're going to be tasking you with an exercise right now that I'm going to send you to page 8 of our working document. I'm going to highlight the section in the working document, and I'm going to also pull it up for you to see on my screen right now. And so for those of you that don't have this working document up, if you came in late, it is also our sign-in sheet. So I am going to add the link to it in the chat box as well, so that you have it available. But what we're going to be doing with this particular exercise is we're going to be looking at 2 women and their testimonies about their lives and experiences with anti-Semitism prior to, in the case of one, Hitler's rise to power, and then the impact of Hitler's rise to power on her, and then also the experience of Esther and her upbringing in pre-war Poland. So pre-1939 for Esther, and then pre-1933 and post-1933 for Margaret Lambert. And so this is the spot where I'm at in the working document. And you'll see here that there is a Venn diagram from Eyewitness, which we're going to explore here in just a moment. If you click on that Venn diagram, it's going to download that Venn diagram for you. I'm also going to attach the Venn diagram in the chat box, just in case that you're having some challenges accessing it through the working document. And then I'm also going to put the link for the Arts and Remembrance document that Claire just shared in the chat box as well. We're going to have you look at the testimonies of these 2 women and think about the differences that you see in their testimonies, as well as the similarities that you're seeing. And with these testimonies, one of them is coming from Echoes and Reflections, and the other is coming from Eyewitness, which is the digital platform of one of the Echoes and Reflections partners, the USC Shoah Foundation. Echoes and Reflections is a partnership between the Anti-Defamation League, the USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And so they're the groups that came together in 2005 to start the creation of these incredible resources. And so I'm just going to very quickly navigate through showing you where these actual pieces are located. And then we're going to give you some independent exploration time, but we're also going to guide you through it. So you'll have a choice of how you want to complete this activity, because I know not everyone has a significant level of tech savviness. So we're going to guide you through the exercise as well. But the first testimony that you're going to be looking at is from a woman by the name of Margaret Lambert. Her testimony is located in Unit 2 of Echoes and Reflections. And you can see the little box here on the right-hand side of my screen. If I click on this box, I can play her testimony right from this box. And if I would start playing her testimony, you'll also see that it gives me the ability to access it on YouTube, which allows you, if you'd like, to embed it into a Google Slides presentation or to directly share the link with your students for them to view the testimony independently. All of the testimonies that are part of Echoes and Reflections itself are closed captioned. That is not the case with Eyewitness, but we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Every testimony in Echoes and Reflections has what I call a bio brief. One of the best practices for teaching with visual history testimonies is to tell your students a little bit of background about the individual that they're going to be hearing from. It's important to know context for things like age and location, as well as experience. And in Margaret's case, we know that she was born in April of 1914 in Laufheim, Germany. She was fortunate to flee to the United States in 1937. And she's actually one of the older individuals whose testimony is featured in Echoes and Reflections. Most of our testimonies that are featured are of individuals who were or close to the same age as our students during the time that they were experiencing the events of the Holocaust, because we feel that that helps to foster additional empathy, relevancy, and connection with students. In addition to the little bio brief, every single person featured in Echoes and Reflections also has a larger biography, and that's located in the body of the lesson plan. So if I click on Margaret's name here, you'll see that it pulls up a larger biography. I personally like looking at the printable version of the larger biography. To me, it's just neater and cleaner and more visually pleasing. And so this gives us even more background about Margaret, her family life, her experiences before and after the war, as well as during. And one of the cool things that you can do with these bios is, again, you can clip the URL. If you've got a student that is not as engaged as you'd like them to be, or you have a student that really wants to contribute to the class in some way, shape, or form, you can share the biography with them in advance. And you can say, hey, you know, I've got this speaker that we're going to be hearing from in class tomorrow. Can you read her biography and pick out some things that you'd like to share with the class, and give the students a level of contribution and engagement in allowing them to introduce the so-called guest speaker that they're going to meet through visual history testimony. So that's where you can see Margaret and a little bit more about her if you want to know more about her story after our work with her today. Margaret has a second testimony that you're going to be viewing. You could locate it by going over to the hamburger icon over here on the left, clicking on Nazi Germany and accessing it that way. But I also wanted to take the time now to share with you our testimony video guide. Our testimony video guide, if you click on it, it's pinned at the top of every single one of our units. It lists all of the over 6 testimonies that are featured in Echoes and Reflections. It notes them by unit, lesson plan within the unit, who is speaking, their topic, and the length of time that they're speaking. So if you know that next week you're going to be teaching about the Nuremberg laws and you want to see a testimony on the Nuremberg laws, you can just type that into your find box, and it says, oh wow, here in Unit 3 in the anti-Jewish policy lesson, Herman Cohn speaks about the Nuremberg laws and their effects on Jewish life for 40 seconds. And then you can preview that testimony and have it accessible to you. Or, as I mentioned, there's 2 testimonies from Margaret Lambert. So our first testimony we see is in this unit on anti-Semitism that we just looked at. But then we click here and we see, oh, she's also featured in Nazi Germany. And if you click on the topic, it takes you right to her testimony in that lesson. And so that's another way for you to navigate between the lessons to explore the testimonies. So we're going to have you listen to Margaret's 2 testimonies. And as I mentioned, we'll play them for you through Zoom if you don't wish to do this as an independent exercise. The other testimony that you're going to explore is going to be that of Esther Nisenthal Krinitz. And so to get to her testimony, you're going to be going to eyewitness.usc.edu. I will also drop this link for you in the chat box. As we mentioned in the previous email that you received yesterday, hopefully you signed up for Eyewitness. And if you didn't, again, we're going to be playing these testimonies through the Zoom platform, so you'll have the ability to see them played for you. But to get to Esther's testimony here, once you're logged in and you land in your dashboard, you'll have the ability to search for a testimony. And so we know that Esther's testimony is part of this collection. This is a free service to educators that anyone can sign up for. And if you're going to be doing this exploration independently, you would click on Esther's entire testimony. And then you would go to the 9-minute mark and you can start playing her testimony there. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you about 10 minutes. We'll give you until 10:22. You are going to watch Margaret's 2 testimonies and 3 minutes of Esther's testimony and play around with the Venn diagrams that we gave you. For those of you that are not feeling very strong about your tech, I'm going to now begin by starting with Margaret's 2 testimonies. And I'm going to invite you to, if you'd like to open in a separate screen, your T-square or your Venn diagram to follow along with her testimonies. So here is Margaret's first piece of testimony, where she's going to talk about her experiences growing up Jewish in Germany prior to Hitler's rise to power.
I had a wonderful time. I had my mother and father, and I had an older brother, about 2 years older than I. And once we got over the sibling rivalry, we got to be very good friends, my brother and I. And my parents found out pretty soon that what Margaret wanted, Margaret got. And they let me be my own, because I was not the usual child. But I had my own way of dressing. I didn't like what my mother got for me. I wouldn't wear it. And I was strong-willed. And I knew what I wanted to do very early on in life. I wanted to be a coach, physical education teacher. My parents thought I was a little freaky with all this business about sports that I was so very into. I skated, I skied, I swam, I ran, I climbed. Through my sport activities, there were more non-Jewish people involved than Jewish people. I was the only girl in my class. I was the only Jew in my class, and it never made any difference. I mean, I never felt any anti-Semitism until a certain time. I always knew I was Jewish, but our house, there was no religion practiced, really. I always say, my father said, be a decent human being, that should be your religion, and I think I have practiced that, pretty much.
Okay, so if you are following along with our delivery of the testimonies, if you want to jot down any notes, just any observations about Margaret's experience, you can feel free to do that. I'm now going to transition to her second piece of testimony. And so if you're using the T-square or the Venn diagram, you may want to wait to fill them in until you hear both components of Margaret's experience. So here is her second piece of testimony.
It started in 1933, really. But I had very good friends of whom I knew that they were members of the Nazi Party since 1928. And she was one of my best friends. She didn't care that I was Jewish, and I didn't care that she was a Nazi. She was one of my sports friends, and we got along very well. But then, of course, in 1933, everything changed. like overnight, you could not go into a public place, no restaurants, no swimming pools, no movies, nothing. You couldn't, you were not allowed in any public place anymore. And the people that you knew wouldn't talk to you anymore. Friends that you had, they would shun you, most of them. Not because they hated us all of a sudden, but they were all afraid, because that was the way it was. You talk to a Jew and you'll be punished. It was very hard. I was 19 years old, and all of a sudden I was shut off from everything. I got a letter from my sports club in Ulm that I wasn't welcome there anymore because I was Jewish, and that was the thing that I loved to do most, as I said before, sports. And all of a sudden that was finished. There was nothing I could do. We just were really vegetating, if you want to call it that. So.
All right, so if you want to take a few moments and just jot down any observations that you have about Margaret, about her experiences with anti-Semitism. You can also feel free, if you want to offer any thoughts in the chat box on those two specific pieces of testimony. I'll go ahead and give you a moment to make some notes. All right, now I'm going to head back to the Eyewitness website. And Eyewitness, as I mentioned, it is the digital platform of our partners at the USC Shoah Foundation. USC Shoah Foundation collected over 50,000 testimonies of Holocaust survivors, liberators, and rescuers in the aftermath of Steven Spielberg's creation of Schindler's List. And their goal was to preserve these testimonies and then make them available to future generations. And Eyewitness is one of the ways that they have made it available. It is a platform that is both student and teacher facing. And it is a really multifaceted platform that has lots of different ways of engaging with testimony, including the ability to view over 3,000 full-length testimonies of individuals who were survivors, liberators, and rescuers during the Holocaust, as well as individuals who were victims or rescuers of other genocides, including the Cambodian genocide, the Rwandan genocide, the current violence against the Rohingya, as well as the Armenian genocide and the Guatemalan genocide. And so we were very fortunate to find that Esther's testimony was one of 3,000 that were chosen out of those over 50,000 testimonies that were available. And so it was really exciting to make that discovery. I'm actually going to start her testimony where she's going to be speaking about, she just mentioned like the school setting in her specific community. And now she's going to talk about relations between Jews and non-Jews that parallels the kind of conversation that Margaret was having about peer groups. And so here is Esther in her own words.
Handwork, like embroidery, things like that.
Is that where you went to school?
That's where I went to school.
And that was a public school?
Public school.
What was the nearest big city?
Well, the big city would be Lublin.
What were the relations like between the Jewish families and the Christian families in your community?
It's always that the Jews try to stay out of the way, not to antagonize, but there were hidden hatred. They didn't display it, but the children would usually, you know, obviously the children had to learn home in order to have that hatred.
What anti-Semitism did you experience in your community when you were growing up?
In the village, in this village, I mean, before the war, I don't think there was that visible anti-Semitism, except for the hoodlum young kids. And there was one guy that he would always be drunk. We went to the market on a Thursday to Rachov, to Annapol. Annapol had two names, Rachov. Most of the time we called it Rachov. And he would get drunk and come home. He would always break the windows by the Jews, knock the windows out. And he tried to come to us once, but we had this big dog, an attack dog. He was trained to attack by the throat. And he climbed over the fence, and the dog was loose, moving around over the property, and he jumped at them by the neck, and he screamed, "Hersh, Hersh, Hersh, save me, Ratui." So my father opened the window, and it was summertime, and he called the dog. Once my father, he was very obedient to the dog. Once my father called him Burek, and he just stopped. So my father went out, and he said, "What are you doing in my property?" He climbed over. And he said, "I wanted to talk to you. You know I like you." To my father, because he was drunk. So my father let him out. He said, "Don't ever try this again. Next time I'm not going to call the dog off." So, and then there would be stealing, like growing up, there would even people, the Jews, have to worry about them not even steal a horse too. They could steal, even though the locks were on the stables and the stalls. But they kept a watch. They kept a watch. But my father, because of the dog, nobody could come to the property, this dog, so they poisoned him. They threw something like a bowl of meat and chopped up glass, because the dog died, so my father wanted to know what happened to it.
Okay, so in the chat box, I'd invite you to share some just basic reflections. Obviously, if you had more time, you would fill out the T-square or the Venn diagram a little bit more fully. But some observations on similarities and differences between the experiences of Esther and Margaret. So Rebecca mentions that Margaret and her family, like so many Jews, were proud Germans and very assimilated, much like our DACA young people who have only known their American life. And as Terry Pratchett put it, evil begins when you begin to treat people as things. And I certainly wholeheartedly agree with that, Rebecca. And I think that's a great connection to make. Margaret, Susan mentions, led a more integrated life, while Esther's showed that the Jews and non-Jews were more separated. And that's one of the things I think is really powerful to show students when we're talking about different human stories, is that the experience of Jews in Eastern Europe was much more different than the experience of many Jews in Western Europe. And I think that's critical. We don't want our students to lump all Jews into the same experience group and category. Their lives are very different. Rebecca mentions, it struck me that they both said that there was very little anti-Semitism initially, but that this grew with time and the progression of Nazi power. Pamela also mentions there's a difference in the fact that they're urban versus rural. More Jews in Germany were in urban settings. In Poland, with a much larger Jewish population, you did have Jews that lived in major cities. In fact, Warsaw had one of the largest Jewish populations in the world prior to the Holocaust, I believe second largest to New York City. But there were still many, many more Jews in rural areas of Poland than there were in Germany. Any other final thoughts? So we wanted to take a moment and share with you these two pieces to broaden the story that we're exploring through Esther's artwork. Karen mentions that underlying hatred was unleashed to be widespread, unfortunately, in both experiences. And that's a similarity that students can also make, as well as Jane mentioning that in both societies, you know, children were recruited into the ideology. And so these are some key takeaways that you can have. If you go to our main sheet now, you'll see that you do have a 5-minute break. We're going to resume at 10:30 with a very special session with Bernice, Esther's daughter. I've provided with you some coronavirus stretches that my students have been amused by through some of our synchronous learning sessions this year. And so I wanted to share them with you, but certainly feel free to get up, refill your cup of coffee, take a bio break. We'll also make sure that we continue to answer questions that you may have in the chat box. And I'll also be making some updates to our overall document as well. So thank you all for your participation thus far, and we'll see you back here at 10:30.
All right, everyone, it is 10:30, so we're back from our short break. Thanks everyone for tuning in still with us. So I'm excited to introduce you all to Bernice Steinhardt, who is the daughter of Esther Krinitz. And she's also the founder of Art and Remembrance, a nonprofit organization. Oh, what happened to?
And also real quick before, as we get started again, just a reminder for folks, the link we just shared again on that shareable document or where the sign-in sheet is located. So if you have not done so, please sign in. Important information is there for us. Thank you.
Okay. So, all right, Bernice, if you want to get started.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's such a privilege for me to be able to share something of the art and story of my mother, Esther Krinitz. Is my slide presentation up? No.
Nope, it's just you.
Okay. Is my screen being shared?
Not yet.
Okay. While I'm fumbling here, you already know that my mother, Esther Krinitz, grew up in a small town, a village really in the center of Poland. And she was 12 years old in 1939 when the Germans came into her village and occupied it for 3 years until October 1942, when they ordered all the Jews of her village to report to a nearby train station. And my mother decided she didn't want to go. No one knew exactly what was going to happen to the Jews. Certainly my mother didn't. But having lived under German occupation for 3 years, they had a pretty good idea that whatever was coming was not going to be good. So my mother took her next youngest sister, Manya, who was then 13, and the two of them said goodbye to their families, and they never saw them again. I always heard these stories my whole life. I don't even actually remember a time when I didn't know my mother's stories. But when my mother was about 50, she decided that she really wanted my sister and me to see what her home and her family looked like. She had never been trained as an artist. She actually didn't know how to draw, but she could sew anything. And so she took a large piece of fabric and she filled it in with stitches. I'm looking for some feedback here. Are you seeing the first slide of my presentation?
So we're seeing the whiteboard.
Okay.
You go to screen share, it should show either the whiteboard or your slides when you go to screen share.
Let me start again with the sharing. Okay. I apologize. I was having some internet problems earlier and it sort of became a big distraction here. At any rate, my mother took a large piece of fabric, she filled it in with stitches, and eventually she went on to create 36 of these pieces altogether.
There we go.
Okay, great. And these are now actually all on display at the American Visionary Art Museum. They've traveled quite widely, the exhibit, but I hope that you'll be able to see them at AVAM in Baltimore relatively soon. So now I wanted to, I hope that all of you, many of you, had a chance to watch the film about my mother through the eye of the needle last night, your homework assignment. I know some of you tweeted about it. I thank you for watching the film. It gives you another glimpse of my mother. And please feel free to continue to tweet if you'd like. That's still an option for you. Now I wanted to share with you some images that are, not all of them were in the film, and then I wanted to talk about some others. And then please, if you feel like it, you can share your comments and I'll try to, or questions, and I'll try to get to them at the end of my presentation. You can find all of the images that all 36 of the images on our website, artandremembrance.org, but you can also find them on the Sutori platform, and I know Claire will share the link with you. And on Sutori, we have, this is sort of the front page of it, we have not only the images, but also discussion questions, activities that you can share with your students as you go through the art and the story. Sorry. This is the very first picture that my mother did when she finally worked up the courage to do it. She was very motivated to share her story with me and my sister. She did this just for me and my sister Helene. She just wanted to show us what her home and her family looked like. And this was the very first picture that she did, in which she included herself at the bottom of the picture, bringing water up from the river, and she included her mother, her parents, her mother and father, her sisters, and her sister Manya, with whom she survived, waiting at the top of the hill for her. And this is the picture of the recreation of Esther's childhood home that's in the center of the gallery at the Visionary Art Museum, with the thatched roof and the lace curtains and the animals in front of the house. It's really stunning. When Rebecca Hoffberger told me that she was going to do this, it took my breath away, just the idea of bringing Esther's artwork and her memories to life in this way. So I really hope you can see this in the not too distant future. She did several pictures of her life before the war. And as I go through these pictures, as you look at them online, you'll note that all of the pictures of her war years are bordered in black. But the pictures that she did of her life before the war and after the war, she used different colors to mark the difference in time. So she used just a snapshot of how she used color as part of her story. And this picture I love because it's just incredibly beautiful, where she describes herself walking on a pair of stilts her brother had made. And she notes that she walked all the way to their grandparents' house without falling. And to me, it's so emblematic of her character that she pictured herself, she remembered herself leading her brother and sisters on the way, head and shoulders above them. Although she was always a small woman, she remembered herself in this way. And she was so enthusiastic about her embroidery. This is the only picture she did that in which she embroidered actually in the border. She just loved that motif of wheat. This is a screenshot from the Sutori page, which has a little narrative from me there underneath the picture. And then it has some discussion prompts about relating to students' own family and inviting them to share a warm memory of their own family life. This is now the beginning of the war, and this is Esther's memory of how the war arrived in her village. And you'll note that the border on this picture is in black, and she remembers a troop of Nazi soldiers riding up in front of her grandparents' house, and one of the soldiers getting off his horse to cut her grandfather's beard off. In Poland, Jews, Jewish men, older Jewish men in particular, grew their beards long, and that was a distinction between them and Polish people, that Jewish people always had beards. So this was, when the soldier cut off her grandfather's beard, it was a sign of disdain and also tremendous disrespect. And this was my mother's first glimpse of what the war would mean for them. When they, shortly after the Germans got there, they set up, they took all the young boys and girls of the village, teenagers, and set them to work digging this tank trench. And here my mother recalled these young Jewish boys and girls, including her brother. And at the bottom of the picture in the caption, she lists their names. So she intended this to be a memorial for these young boys and girls, none of whom survived the war. I wanted to point out, though, just from those of you who are interested in textile, my mother always paid a lot of attention to fabric and her fabric choices. And here she found this fabric that resembled dug earth. And then she filled in with stitches. She traced or stitched the shape of rocks around them to give the impression of what the digging was unearthing. And then this is now in April of 1941, so a couple of years after the Germans arrived. And by this point, they had set up in Poland hundreds and hundreds of labor camps, of these slave labor camps all over the country. And this was one in a village called Gospodarów near my mother's house. And by this point also, Jews were, their livelihoods were completely disrupted. My mother's father was a horse trader. He couldn't travel around the countryside to do his business. Her mother used to sell poultry at market. Her livelihood was disrupted. So my mother and her sister, Manya, the next youngest sister, went to work for Polish farmers to help support the family. And here my mother is spreading manure in the fields when she heard her cousin Moisha call her name, and she looked up to see him behind the barbed wire fence. And she knew it made her terribly sad, because she knew that Moisha and his father, who was also in the camp, were tailors, and they were completely unused to hard labor. And she knew that they would not survive this. By far the worst camp in the vicinity of my mother's home was called Janoshev. And one day my mother, it was a beautiful day in June, and my mother and her sister decided to take the cows that they were tending, not theirs. Jews were not allowed to own livestock at this point. So they had the cows and chickens and so on that they had they had to sell them. So here they're tending their farmers' cows, and they came upon, they were close to this camp, which my mother didn't realize was right there. And they saw through the trees, they could see the Germans whipping these young Jewish men and boys. And when they were too exhausted to work, they were led into the forest and shot there. So what I wanted to say about this picture, when my mother, I would see my mother every week, we would have dinner together, and I would see all of these pictures as she was working on them. And although they were all incredibly beautiful, when I saw this one, I was literally awestruck, because in this picture, I think she captures the essence of war from the perspective of those who were its victims. So on the one side is this incredible beauty, the trees bearing fruit, the flowers blooming, and on the other, the scene of incredible brutality and terror. And it is so stark, the contrast that she creates between these two aspects of life. Life went on, everyday life, the beauty of everyday life went on, but next to the horror of war. I showed this picture, I did a presentation for a class and asked them, a fourth grade class, and I asked them what they thought of this picture, and one boy raised his hand to say, "This picture shows me that there's a thin line between good and evil." This is, again, a screenshot from the Sutori page, in which the question posed here asks students to reflect on what happened to the Jews when the Germans first came to Esther's village. And of course, when you look at all of the images, you can see a progression of how things worsened over time. So this is now in June 1942, and orders came from the Nazis to my mother's family that Reuven, her brother, had to report to Yanishev, the camp we just saw the picture of, that death camp. Well, it wasn't, let me just correct myself. It wasn't technically a death camp, but there were very few survivors. And orders came for Reuven to go to report to the camp. And my mother's mother, Rachel, was horrified because her son had just recently recovered from typhus, which was then somewhat endemic. And she knew he would never survive. And she begged her husband to go in his place. But Esther's father, Hersh, said, "No, neither one of us is going." And he took his son, and the two of them went into the forest where they were tapping pine tar to sell to the Polish farmers. I always thought that my mother's act of resistance, of defiance, and not going with everyone else, her family, was inspired, let's say, by her father's example. This was his act of resistance. But over the next couple of months, his spirit was broken and there was no more resistance. Again, this is just a month before the deportation. The Nazis came to her door before dawn. They banged on the door, ordered the whole family to walk out onto the street on the road and lined them up there at gunpoint. During the occupation, I mean, Jews were not murdered in large groups as they were in the countryside, as they were when they were ultimately deported, and the final solution, the mass extermination of the Jews, began. But during the occupation period from 39 to 42, there were these frequent acts of brutality and terror, and people were shot in their homes and in the road for nothing, just as sort of rogue acts by individual soldiers, because this was not supposed to be happening then. But of course, it was terrorizing. And here my mother remembered this scene with their Polish neighbors in the foreground looking on as they were lined up. And finally, the town official came and told them, the soldiers, that these were people who had always lived in the village. They belonged there. They weren't from outside, and the German soldiers let them go back to their home. So this is now October 1942. October 15th, 1942, the Jews of the village were ordered to leave their homes by 10 o'clock in the morning or be shot. And my mother decided she didn't want to go, and she begged her father to think of the name of a friend of his, a Polish farmer that they could go to work for, because they had been working for Polish farmers throughout most of the occupation. So her father gave her a name of his friend Stefan, and here they are saying goodbye to their family. This was one of the earliest pictures my mother did, and she always said it was the hardest picture for her to do, not technically, but emotionally. And yet, she went on 10 years later, she went back to this leave taking and created another picture. And you can see how much her technical abilities, her confidence had grown in that period, from the first earlier picture where it was just two-dimensional, and this one in which the composition is so much more complex and sophisticated. But here, she and her sister are out of the picture. They're walking down the road with a neighbor, and it's her mother and father and the rest of her family who are heading to the wagons to join the rest of the Jews on their way to the train station in Krasnik. And this is not a memory of my mother that she could actually see. She was imagining what it looked like from her parents' perspective. So it's interesting in that regard. But she also wanted us to see, and she imagined how it must have felt for them to see their older daughters going off, but she also wanted us to see what was being left behind. So here they are on the road to Krasnik, where they met with their cousin Dina. Manya didn't want to go with Esther. She wanted to stay with the family, and it was only because their mother told Manya to go with Esther that she went, that she listened. And now, as they were getting closer to Krasnik, Esther just wanted to leave the road and go to Stefan's house in another village. Manya wanted to stay, hoping to be reunited with their family. And here their cousin Dina told Manya to go with Esther. And I've always said that Manya survived because she listened, and Esther survived because she didn't. So here they come to Stefan's house, and he kept them for a couple of days. He embraced them when he saw them. They told them that they were Hirsch's daughters. He put them up into the attic to string tobacco leaves there, but after a couple of days, he had to put them out because everyone in the village knew that they had come to him, and the Germans he was afraid the Germans would come and kill all of them. So in this picture, Esther compresses the events of several days' time into one single image, which is really quite remarkable for an untrained artist to even imagine that, no less executed. But at this point, she realized that they could not survive as Hirsch's daughters anymore. And she made up these identities for them as these two Polish Catholic farm girls, with the plan to go to another village where no one knew them and look for work there as these two Polish girls. They came to a village called Grabowka, and they found work there. And actually, the farmer who's pictured in the lower left-hand corner, excuse me, who my mother called Dziadek, which is the Polish word for grandfather, he was very, very kind to her. And because in part she was such a good worker and he needed her help on his farm. And one day, these two German soldiers came into the garden that she was tending, and my mother was very afraid of being engaged with them and was trying so hard not to be seen. When all of a sudden the bees that the farmer kept, and you can see their hives in the background, they started swarming around the soldiers, and they ultimately drove them off. And so my mother would always say that this was the day that the bees saved her. So nature, you can see in looking at her pictures that she never lost the sense of beauty of the natural world. And nature was her shelter and protector. And here, nature took the form of the bees in protecting her. This is now in July of 1944, when the Russian troops were moving westward, and they came into the village and liberated it, with all the villagers rushing to the road to see them coming through. So it was after this that my mother went back to Mniszek, her home village, and tried to find out to see if any of her family had survived, which they had not. But one of the neighbors told her they might have been taken to this camp called a concentration camp, Majdanek, which was in the city of Lublin. And so my mother went there. You can see her at the bottom of the picture in her yellow dress rather, looking, I always thought she looked like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. She has a little straw basket. And this was the first time that she saw with her own eyes what had happened to the Jews on a mass scale. And the features of the camp are very compressed here, because actually the camp is huge and spread out over a large area. But my mother included the gas chambers and the crematorium, and at the back of the picture, this field of giant cabbages growing on a bed of human ashes. The Russians had liberated Majdanek, and they gave her a tour of the camp. And after that, my mother joined the Polish army, which was then under Soviet command, and she was 17 years old then. And here's actually a picture of her on the left in her uniform. She eventually became a sergeant. So after the end of the war, Esther went back to Poland she had gone with the army all the way to Germany. She went back to Poland to get Manya, and the two of them went back to Germany to a DP camp, a displaced persons camp in the American zone in Germany. And that's where my mother met my father. It's where my aunt met my uncle. They all got married in the camp, as did many other young people whose greatest desire was to resume their lives. And my father had relatives in the United States, so they applied to emigrate to the United States. And here my mother depicted our arrival in New York. That's me sleeping on my father's shoulder. And my father's cousin, Clara, who's in the navy dress, came to greet us. And my mother recalls her saying to me, after she met us, she looked at me and she said, "My dear child, this will be your America." And of course, my mother has the iconic image of liberty and freedom. And it was the first that greeted her when they arrived in the United States. And when we think about this in light of what's happening in the world today, I note that the reception and the feeling that my mother had when she came to New York is not one that's so widely shared by current day immigrants who arrive, and refugees who arrive in the United States. Their experience is often very different. And I think that's a very important contrast when we look to the past and what happened during the Holocaust. We also need to look to what happened to those people, those survivors of the Holocaust, when they managed to go to Israel, which many of them did, or especially to come to the United States, and reflect on how that image differs from what we see today. Pardon me. So with that, I'm going to pause here and ask for any questions. I haven't, let me turn on my chat box. Well, I'll stop my sharing. Yeah. Thanks to everyone for these beautiful comments. Yeah, I'm glad I see some of you have actually seen the exhibit, so that's great. You know, this was the third time that the work was exhibited at the Visionary Art Museum, so you can imagine we have a very strong connection to Rebecca Hoffberger and to her love of the work, and it's very meaningful to us to have it there.
So Bernice, there's a couple questions. One is, someone wants to know about how long each piece took. I know that probably varies, but maybe you want to speak to that. Another question was if you ever wanted to visit Poland and see the places, so you can also speak to that, which is a great story about you and your mom, and then I'll pass some more to you if we have time.
Yeah, great. So actually this question about how long it took my mother to do the work is our most frequently asked question along with what happened to Manya. So I'll tell you both. Manya is still living in Dallas, Texas, where her family, her children and their children are living. My mother died, unfortunately, many years ago. You know, as you might imagine, each piece took differing amounts of time to create. But I figure on average, she did about 3 to 4 a year. And so, you know, every 3 or 4 months, it took about 3 to 4 months on average. Some pieces were much more difficult and challenging to do, and others less so. I completely agree with Linda that it would be lovely to get these pieces to England. They've actually been to Poland, not the original artwork. We also have an exhibit of very, very high quality photographic images that we've traveled around the United States and that were exhibited at the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow in Poland, which was amazing. We went back with my mother to Poland in 1999, not long before she died. As you might imagine, it was just incredible to be there, to see the countryside and the places that she came from with her after she had done just about all of these artworks. And my mother was very shocked at how much the countryside there had changed for the worse. You know, things declined under 50 years of Soviet rule, but, or communist rule, I should say. But I was shocked at how much it looked just like my mother's pictures. There were these ribbon fields of flowers. You know, the houses that survived looked just like the ones she depicted. And then a few years ago, in 2016, I think it was, my husband and I went back to Poland to, well, we went earlier when the exhibit in Krakow opened, and then we went back and traveled to the places near her village to show the film that you saw, Through the Eye of the Needle, to Polish audiences. And that was just astounding, in part because the people living there today didn't know very much about their history, or what the history of Jews in their area, in their villages. And so it was remarkable, not only for me to be there to connect with my mother's history, but to bring a piece of their history to the people there. It was just incredible.
And also, when you went to Poland, you were able to see her old home site. Do you want to say a little bit about that, the house that she lived in?
Well, yeah. Actually, the physical house was not the house that she lived in, but on that property lived the family that took over her house when she and her family left. They actually owned the land and helped to build the house. So it was not a confiscation as occurred elsewhere. But the family and the son of the family, the man who was then my mother's age, was still living in that house. And my mother showed him pictures of her artwork. And when he saw them, he said, yes, it looked just like that. So it was great validation for her.
There's another question. Did your mom pass the activity of embroidery to you? And
another frequently asked question.
And also, did she work alone, or were you or your sister present with her?
Oh, she worked alone, but I helped her with her captions, just her spelling, and helping her to frame it in English. Was obviously not her native language, so she asked for my help with it. You know, when I was, if you saw the film, you saw that my mother asked me to tell her story. She wanted me to write her story. And I told her that she needed to tell her story herself. And she did. She found a way that was so very powerful and so unique to tell her story.
I guess a couple other questions. Just, I know we can't really get into, you know, Polish, I guess their changing of history, which has been happening. But I guess one of the questions is, did your mom ever get to see the exhibit and how it was received? And also maybe talk a little bit about the museum, because there's questions about, you know, the Jewish museum in Poland.
Yeah. So she never saw her work exhibited in a museum, but we live near Washington, D.C. And while my mother was still living, her work was exhibited at the largest synagogue here in D.C. and Washington Hebrew congregation. And so she spoke to the entire congregation. There were over 300 people who came to hear her speak. And she did what I gave you a piece of, but she did a slide talk. It was back in the day. And she did a slide talk to 300 people. My mother never was a public speaker, but she had them completely spellbound. And then there was an exhibit of the work in the large sort of lobby of it. So she got to see all these people listening to her tell her story and watch and then looking at the artwork. And she didn't, as I said earlier, she didn't do it for a wide audience. She did it just for me and my sister so we could see her family and her home. But I think it just validated what she had done once she could see it kind of through their eyes and see the reception it met with, that all these people cared about what had happened to her and her family.
And Bernice, her story is continuing to impact and inspire. Dina says that she shows your mom's work to women, elders in her community, many who are Holocaust survivors, and it's really moving for them. They get together every week to embroider and knit, and it's always inspiring to see your mother's work. Also, it is true that there is a little film clip of Bernice and her mother visiting Poland. And also, do you want to talk a little bit about the teacup that if people get to the museum?
Oh, yeah. So another one of the incredibly beautiful aspects of the exhibit that Rebecca created was the way in which she included not only, and I should mention, not only these other stories of genocide and othering, as we call it, the way in which people have treated others who are not like them. And she mentioned Rwanda, South Africa, Native Americans. But she also included in the exhibit of my mother's work, she included very personal things. She included things that have always been just in our family possession. So one of them is a cup that used to belong to Jadek. Remember the farmer that my mother lived with? When we went back to Poland in 1999 with my mother, we went to the village of Grabowka, the village that saved her, as she said. And there she was reunited with these women who had been her girlfriends as teenagers when she lived there. And one of them went back, one of them was living in the house that used to be Jadek's house. And she went back into the house and came back out with a cup that in which my mother used to bring Jadek his coffee every day. And when my mother saw that cup, she begged this woman to let her have it, because it was the only thing that she had of that time of her life. And so after my mother died, the cup came to me, Jadek's cup, and now it's on display right next to the picture of the bees at the Visionary Art Museum. It's just very personal. As Rebecca said, this is an exhibit that is so much in keeping with what my mother wanted. She wanted her family to be remembered. And so this is not only a story of her, it's a story of our family.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Bernice. And throughout today and tomorrow, feel free to ask questions and we'll make sure as many of them can get answered. And thank you all. We're going to continue with Bernice. Sorry, sorry. Yeah, I just messed up here. Yeah.
No, so in the next session, we would like to hear from you about the themes in Esther's art and story that you think would resonate particularly with your students. And I think Jen is going to lead us into that next session. So again, let me just thank you so much for allowing me to share my mother's art and story with you, and I do hope you get to see it in person.
Thank you, Bernice, for sharing that insight. I had the privilege of, on one of my last trips before COVID-19 kind of shut down the world, I had the privilege of coming to AVAM and seeing the exhibition. And I'm so tremendously glad I did. And the stories that you shared with us today certainly helped to broaden the connections that I made during my visits. I really appreciate hearing from you. There was some great conversation in the chat box, and Claire, of course, shared many of the questions that you had and some of the comments as well. And what we're going to do next is we're going to, in just a few minutes, split all of you into some breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, we would like to foster a conversation amongst the small groups regarding themes that you saw in Esther's work and that you think would resonate with your students. And so in sharing one of the specific images from Esther's collection in a Jamboard to set the tone, we have created a Jamboard for you. Jamboard is part of the Google suite of tools. Again, it's a free resource. It works great for online student engagement. This particular Jamboard currently has 2 slides, but we have so many participants this morning that we'll probably add some additional slides for you. And we'll do that here in just a moment. But what you do when you get to the Jamboard, as you're having discussions in your group, we'd like to make them active discussions about the theme. So if you think of a theme that you saw, one person I think in the chat box mentioned kindness, and today being inspired, and hopefully all of us can be inspired to perform an unsolicited act of kindness. You, in the Jamboard, click on the sticky note feature, which is located here on the left-hand side of the screen. It brings a blank sticky note up. You can change the colors to whatever you want. Blue is my favorite color. And so kindness would be a theme that I saw. You can expand upon that. You can just keep it simple. And then once you're done with that single sticky note, you hit save and it displays it on the Jamboard. And then you have the ability to actually move it wherever you want on the Jamboard. So since that was not my original idea, I'm going to just delete that particular one, but I wanted to share that with you as a demonstration of how to do this. And the Jamboard link, again, is available to you both in the chat box and in our master document. So you have access to it in both places. At this time, if you have questions that you want to enter in the chat box regarding how to access or use the Jamboard, please feel free to put them there. But I know that Vivette is going to go ahead and get us organized into some chat rooms here in just a moment. When she does put us in the chat or into the breakout rooms, you're going to be given the option to join the breakout room. You'll have to click that on your screen to get you into the breakout room. And if for any reason you get kicked out while you're in the breakout room, it's going to bring you back into a main room, and Vivette will be monitoring that main room periodically to get you back into a breakout room. So once you join the breakout room, you can click on the Jamboard link then, or you can pull the Jamboard link up now while we're getting everyone organized into the breakout rooms, whatever works best for you.
All right, thanks everybody. Right now we're just waiting for everyone to get back from the breakout session.
Thanks, Mavette. That was seamless.
Thanks.
And we had great conversations in our breakout room.
Nice, awesome.
So let's see. We're waiting on.
Okay, everybody should be back now.
I see Carrie Weber on the screen, and I just wanted to say hi.
How are you doing?
Great, great. I'm so glad that you're here.
I'm so glad to be here. This is a great
I'm going to tell my sister, who will tell your mother.
It's like we're waiting on one.
So we had a very international breakout group. We had Dina from Argentina and Carolyn, and yeah, and another from England. So really nice to.
So I'm just scrolling through here to see if I can find Dina's, well, anyway, Dina, if you can hear me, I just wanted to say hello. I'm assuming you're the same Dina that from Argentina that.
She is. She explained to me that you guys were supposed to have a visit connection, so.
Yeah, there you are. I see you now. Yeah, they were planning to come as part of their, I guess, field trips to come to the States and to come to Baltimore to see the exhibit, but hopefully it will again happen.
Yes, let's hope.
So Linda is also asking who else is from the UK, but we can all, you know, connect later. They're connecting now. Good. I think we might have 3 from the UK, maybe more. And if anyone else is, you know, from outside of the States, let us know. We're so happy to have you here. So let's regroup, and we have the Jamboard. So Bernice, I'm sure you can see here, are there a couple of these that you want to pull out and just before we go into our next session?
I've lost my Jamboard. Let me get back to the chat.
Let me see. Seeing so many perspectives despite being trapped. That one's really interesting. And that feeling of being trapped is going to kind of resonate with what, you know, we'll be talking about. There's been, even in the comments before, someone said something about that vegetative state that Margaret talked about, and said, well, vegetative state, that's how we must all feel in COVID. So this kind of entrapment, and I know as trapped as we might feel, and I'm buying you time, Bernice, so as trapped as
I'm there now. I'm just
okay, great. Is that we still, we still see beauty, and I love that someone brought that up. Go ahead, Bernice.
Yeah, we were talking about this. So the love of nature, the beauty of the world, the restorative power of nature. I'm so glad that a number of you highlighted these themes, because they were so important to my mother. I mean, she never stopped turning to nature for her comfort. Even as an adult in a safe environment. Family, I know, is another theme that came up, and that this was something that my mother did for her family. She, this was all that she had left of her family were her memories. And it was so important for her, it became so important to her to be able to share those memories of the family that she lost with the family that she created. And that was really exactly why she needed to tell her story for her new family, you might say. I noticed that resiliency was one of the themes that a few people focused on, and clearly, if there was ever a story of resiliency, this was one. In our breakout group, we were talking about how Esther had to think on her feet all the time. She never felt safe, but she always had to adapt to new, you know, what was going on in her immediate environment. And, you know, one of the things that occurred to me was that my mother people have remarked on her memory, her incredible visual memory, which is another theme that came up, the importance of remembrance. But my mother's visual memory, I think, was something that she probably had to begin with, but I think her survival depended on it. And so she was forced in a way to be intensely aware of what was happening with her. And so the memories of her life 50 years before she created these pictures, her memory never faded, and the visual memory was so intense as well.
So her art as a source and also as a resource for remembering and making her survival relevant to people now. One of the things that Art and Remembrance and Bernice have done, and she's going to speak to that, is bringing these projects into the community, into a community setting. And she's going to do a little bit of a show and tell. And as you look at these, kind of think about how either you're doing something in your community, either using Esther's material, story or other materials, and then we'll have time to hear from you after Bernice does her show and tell. Thanks.
Yeah. Let me just pull this up.
And just a heads up on the time, it is 11:39, almost 11:40. So hang in there another 20 minutes. Thanks for sticking around for as long as you have. I know this session's a little long, but this has been amazing. It's really been great to get to know you all.
And if you have questions, throughout Bernice's presentation, put them in there and we can either get to them, maybe today or tomorrow. The Jamboard will be up. You can, use that as a reference. And Bernice, do you need help? Do you want us to pull up the slides?
I'm sorry, I just had the wrong presentation up, so I need to get back to.
And I think also on that theme of kindness, and Jen, you can also jump in with me here, is, one of the pedagogical practices is to instill empathy. And this really, I think, in terms of showing the kindness of the people who helped Bernice in her journey, that unlike a lot of, like I said before, the black and white photos that are often shown to teach, the Holocaust, these pictures, I think, do resonate with young learners, and actually learners of all ages.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of our approaches, we really strongly discourage educators from showing super graphic images, because a lot of times we see that those traumatize students more than they, foster that desire to learn. And so I think that the power of these images that Esther has created is that they engage students in a way that is appropriate for their level, and also in a way that doesn't deter them from wanting to learn more about this topic. So I think that's one of the real powers of this. And then, fostering empathy through the experiences of Esther and the individuals that were involved in her journey is incredibly powerful.
Right. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about trauma-informed classroom and running these programs with that philosophy. But here is the show and tell, and think about, again, how you would be able to maybe do something like this in your community.
Yeah. So I just talked about how Esther created these artworks and told her story for me and my sister. But it was clear to us that her legacy was really for more than just us, and that we needed to bring her art and story out into the world, and we needed to use it to inspire and educate, and very importantly, to shine a light on the social justice issues that are embedded in her story of racism and anti-Semitism and othering that are obviously still very much with us. And every time I say, more now than ever, but every day it seems it just grows, the relevance of these topics. And in fact, one of the things that I really love about the AVAM exhibit is that it brings in not only, as I said before, not only Esther's work, but also stories and art of genocides and othering, racism, and so on that have taken place elsewhere in the world. So this image, I mentioned we were in Poland, my husband and I were in Poland a few years ago. And while we were there, the Syrian refugee crisis came to the world's attention. And this was the photograph on the front page of the International New York Times. And as soon as I saw it, I was immediately reminded of this picture of the road to Krasnik. And it's, I think, a very powerful reminder that the past is still very much with us. And in you know, I like to, there's a William Faulkner quote that seems incredibly relevant. He said, "The past is never dead. In fact, it's not even past." And this is the visual counterpart to that. So to highlight these issues and to bring them into contemporary times, we created a program called Stitching Our Stories. And these are workshops for students and in classrooms, and also for adults who are English language learners, many of them recent immigrants or refugees to the United States themselves. And we give them materials. Here you can see they're using felt and some notions that allow them to create their own story cloths. And, you know, typically, these are people who, talking about immigrant communities, these are people who have very powerful stories which no one ever asks them about. They're stories that they might share within their own families, but they're not generally shared with a wider community. And they might cover, the story cloths might cover a variety of themes. For the immigrant groups, they were often about journeys and what they left, the homes they left behind, and the homes, what they looked forward to when they got to the United States, the opportunities, the families, the journeys themselves in many cases. In one school in which we did a program, and actually it was an elementary school, and they did the fifth grade there rather, did their story cloths on the theme of resilience. And many of these students were from immigrant families themselves, and they told stories about their parents and grandparents, relatives who had come to the United States under very arduous conditions, who had left very arduous conditions. They were very, very powerful. And in another school, they did a project on the theme of heroes in their family, which was also inspired by Esther's story. So these workshops can be up to 2 hours, or can be as little as 2 hours, I should say, to give students time to create them and share them. And that's why we use felt and glue. But they can also, if there's more time, they can be stitched, and they can be longer extended art projects. It has a lot of flexibility. So what you see, the image on the right hand of the screen there, is an exhibition of the story cloths that were created by this class at Santa Fe Community College of English language learners. And we included this adjacent to, in the same gallery, as an exhibit of Esther's artwork. This was in the Santa Fe, New Mexico Convention Center. They have a community art gallery there. And you can see, you know, they have their stories in squares of white cloth with their pictures above. And these are all online in the Stitching Our Stories gallery. So you can go in and see the images as well as read the stories, which many of which were written in Spanish, and I think we provided English translations in those cases as well. But this exhibit was up for about a month, I think, and it drew hundreds of visitors. And I think people understood and felt deeply the connection between these stories of immigration that were separated by continents and decades, but still expressed a kind of common humanity. Here are a couple of them closer up. And this one, this was by a young woman in the English language learner class who says, "It's difficult to say goodbye to my family and my home to go to the USA because I want to find," she put it in quotes, "my great maybe." Now these people were learning English, so they were expressing themselves often in a very original but heartfelt way. It was a fantastic tool to give them to express themselves. This was, this was a stitched piece. One of the workshop participants in Santa Fe, actually, was a sewer. And so she wanted to work on this at home, and we gave her some fabric, and she created this sort of triptych of her family in Guatemala, her home and family, her arrival in Santa Fe with her children and the first time they saw snow. And then in the last panel, the work that she found here, she was teaching an early Head Start program. And someone was critical of her for taking that job instead of being from those more deserving, presumably, and told her she should be working in the fields like other immigrants. And she was appalled, obviously, but also she was very hurt by the disrespect shown to these field workers who served a very important role. And so she included one in the top right side. And this piece is on exhibit at AVAM, along with, as part of the larger Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. While all these pieces were up in the community gallery, we hosted one evening a community conversation. We filled the gallery with chairs and tables and invited people both from the immigrant community, those who had worked on these story cloths, and as well as native-born members of the community. And we gave them prompts, discussion prompts, questions like, what was a moment in your life that you're most proud of, or things that were personal but not intrusively so. And we invited them to talk to one another, simply to get to know one another. And at the end of the evening, well, first of all, while the conversation was going on, you could just feel the buzz in the room. There was so much excitement. And the feedback that we got when we came together, when everyone came together at the end of the conversations, was so moving. People said it was the first time that they had ever felt welcome in Santa Fe, that it was the first time they were not made to feel ashamed of their not speaking English very well. It was the first time that people cared about what they had to say. And on the other side, people said, why haven't we done this before? So this is actually a very powerful way to bring a community together, and inspired by Esther, but then moving on from Esther's story to all these other very rich stories. So as I said, I want to encourage you to visit the Stitching Our Stories gallery on our website. Also the Hero Project page, which is also on our website. And as I mentioned earlier, for an overview of story cloths in other cultures, please visit our Sutori page on that. And also, you can download instructions on creating story cloths, both using felt and glue or stitching them. These are separate sets of instructions, and they're also available. And I think Claire is sharing the links on, in the chat boxes. But
yeah, I had a little trouble. I'll get those to everybody.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they're
and if you also go onto the landing page for education on Art and Remembrance, those are all, you know, quick links to that, and I'll make sure everyone gets them.
Yeah, all the lesson plans that we've created are also on our website as well as on Sutori in PDF version. So you can easily see what's available from that front page of the education section of our website.
Yeah, and we were actually having a little side conversation as people were looking at this because I wanted to crowdsource about virtual tools. And I think Pamela also has a really good point that in this time where students are doing so much online learning, really having them touching those creative tools and using this as an immersive experience, you know, may be important. And that's something, you know, to look into too. It's something I'm trying to do intergenerationally with another one of our local community members to do an intergenerational with grandparents and grandkids. It's been logistically difficult, but you know, this is, I love, Pamela, that you did say that, but I think that also using technology maybe as a planning or, you know, to go back and forth. And you got to see in Bernice's show and tell how, you know, you have community together, and using something like Zoom or something like that, I think would have, you know, some of that connectivity that would help students tell their stories and share their works. And tomorrow we're actually going to have you practice this. So for homework, I'm going to share my screen. And also I would like everybody to continue, if you weren't able to do last night's homework, feel free to continue to either virtually tweet or to use that Padlet to tweet. And the homework for this evening, as we all know, we've been spending a lot of time at home. You know, home can evoke a lot of emotions. It can have you know, comfort, discomfort, routine. So I want everyone to kind of think about the theme of home, how it's a refuge, a confinement, maybe, you know, like I was saying yesterday, you know, every time I think of home, I think of a sink full of sudsy dishes. I can't get away from it. You know, we want you to either draft something written or visual. Just be creative. Let's have fun, and we'll have time to share that tomorrow. Some people in the chat box put some really great tools that maybe you want to play around with, or if you want to just do it, you know, on paper, pencil, take a picture and be ready to share. Let's see, I'm going to just type into the chat box. Oops. I lost my chat box again. It keeps disappearing from me. The Padlet is on your instructions, and maybe if someone can help me here, because my chat box keeps just.
Sure, we can drop it in there for you, Claire.
Yeah, so it's Padlet Elemento Education Community AR. And so you'll just put your homework into that, but also have it ready to share tomorrow. And Becca's going to do a little bit of wrap up, and we appreciate all of you spending these wonderful 3 hours with us, and look forward to you tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and, oh, looks like my vet beat me to it. So the Padlet is in there. Again, thank you so much for hanging in with us. Just to wrap up, there were a lot of questions that came in the chat box, and since this is recorded, I can go in there and like pull some of those questions out for tomorrow for Bernice and Claire. And let's see, I'm trying to think what else we need to do.
Yep, I guess real quick, sorry, Becca, don't mean to interrupt. But yeah, just real quick, if to find the link again, if you don't get it from the chat box for the Padlet homework assignment, this shared document that we have for you all that we put in a couple times, if you go towards the end of day 1, you will find the kind of wrap up assignment and click on that link here. It's gonna drop down, it's gonna give you where that kind of verbiage or that text links to. Click on that and it should direct you to the Padlet kind of assignment where you can add there.
Someone did ask about the session recordings. We'll probably edit them down and put them on our YouTube channels in the coming week probably. So yes, they will be available if you also want to share with your colleagues.
And then Jennifer just wrote in the chat just to make sure, so for kind of that intro of where Jen had us sign in to, I believe it was Merit or something, with that code specifically to sign on in on that last session, that last page, 3rd page, if you want to give kind of your remarks or ending thoughts, questions from today, please, or menti.com was the link. Make sure to go back to that, yeah, and fill it out if you can.
Can I just
Sure.
make one comment? Tomorrow, we're going to be here, relevant to what we've just been talking about. Tomorrow, we're going to hear from one of the our grantees who used Esther's work in her classroom, and we're going to hear about her experience, which was interrupted by the pandemic. Oh. So I think I would just encourage everybody to come back tomorrow. There are a number of really good sessions, but I'm really looking forward to Julie Eisler's.
All right, thank you, Bernice. All right, it's noon, so we're gonna go ahead and sign off. We look forward to seeing everyone back here tomorrow at 9 a.m. All right.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
Everyone. Bye, Julie.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.